Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and beyond. And today our guest shares with us ideas about the language and culture of science and what adjustments we can make to help all students learn.
There are, at times, more new science words in an introductory biology class than there would be in an introductory Spanish class. And the challenge is that in Spanish, you're getting, in Spanish, it's a new word for an old idea. You're still learning about tables and chairs. It's things that you know about. But in science, you're getting new language and new ideas simultaneously. So the language of science is valuable, and that enables us to really isolate ideas at a great level. But I think we've become so culturally ingrained in the culture of science that the complexity of science language becomes invisible to us.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartell.
And earlier, the voice you heard was Dr. Bryan Brown. He's an associate professor of science of education at Stanford University. He's also a former science teacher, and he's been studying the ways to help improve science teaching, particularly in urban communities.
For the last 15 years or so, what I've really paid particular attention to is how language and culture intersect with learning, and what we can do to really maximize students' learning and sense of belonging in teaching science in a way that really speaks to the needs of urban students.
One of the first things we wanted to ask Dr. Brown about is his new book, Science in the City.
The big idea is that we have a missed opportunity in that we really have misunderstood the role of that language plays as a learning device, and we make students' culture invisible. So if we really think about language differently, how we can improve learning, and the second part of the book is really about how we can use technology as a mediator for teaching. So we really have a great opportunity in front of us to improve the way that teaching happens. So, for example, we want diverse teaching environments. Well, we want to hire diverse teachers to come in and teach students. That's a very difficult challenge, right? To hire a demographic of people who represents people from across the country. That is a burden, both based on infrastructure and finances, is going to be very difficult. But what we can do today is make sure that the technology that's in front of the student is extremely diverse. It represents them in who they see, how it sounds. And so there's a psychological subtext there that I think we're missing as an opportunity as we move forward in using technology to teach science.
Can you give us some examples of that? Dale and I work with technology and our students too, and I'd love to hear some of your ideas.
For sure. So one of the things we just did is I've really been influenced by psychologists. And so my former boss was Claude Steele, who famously captured how being aware of stereotypes literally takes that working memory capacity. You know, it's almost like when you're trying to parallel park a car, sometimes you turn the music down. Not that you can't park without the music on, with the music on, you can do it, but it's just distracting. So you turn down that additional noise. And so his work basically suggested that people are aware of stereotypes. Unfortunately, what they do is that it takes up some of their working memory capacity, and they're then going to perform at lower levels. And so imagine yourself in a chemistry classroom, and the person who is teaching you in the video looks like you. We have this strange thing in American science videos where we have British voiceovers everywhere. It's just incredible. I don't know what it was about science teaching, but we use British voiceovers. But what if that person who was offering this explanation of, let's say, quantum theory, spoke with the same Los Angeles accent that kids from Los Angeles spoke like? It could reduce some of this anxiety. So in particular, what we did, there's two studies we recently completed. One was something we called identity matching. And so we created digital textbooks. And in these textbooks, we matched the students with people who look like them. So if a young woman wore a hijab, then the person teaching her offered the explanation wearing a hijab. And so what we found was it dramatically reduced their sense of anxiety and increased their desire to participate in science long term. So we found some really positive gains there. And the second study is we created virtual reality lessons. And so instead of kind of removing kids from their environment, saying, hey, this is great, put on these goggles and let's go to Egypt, we took them into their own neighborhood and enabled them to see the science that was happening in their neighborhood with voices and sounds that look like them. And so part of what we're trying to do is really push the envelope on this idea that the technology can be a great tool for diversifying instruction and making it culturally relevant.
Well, and we've seen a lot of buzz about personalized learning and giving students what they need in terms of the skill and the level. But this is fascinating. I guess in many ways, I didn't think about the role that technology could play in offering a culturally responsive kind of tailored instruction for that. And I think that's a fantastic idea there. Do you think that textbook companies and they're going to be running to provide this, or where could teachers find this?
So that certainly is a challenge. I think there is a movement for online customizable instruction. I think of the CK12 project, which is a free customizable online curricular software. Mm-hmm. But even there, they don't have the option for you to customize based on representation. And so that's an easy adjustment for a company that has taken that focus. Curriculum developers, though, their interests and goals are different, right? Their primary task is to sell curriculum and sell as much of it as they can. Yeah. And so they would need some motivation to determine why would we want to create this customizable type of science curriculum. And I think there's an opportunity there if they are able to see this as something that could help their bottom line and ultimately help students learn.
You mentioned something about language. What are some common pitfalls that science teachers might fall into with their use of language in their students?
Well, certainly the language of science is valuable and that enables us to really isolate ideas at a great level. But I think we've become so culturally ingrained in the culture of science that the complexity of science language becomes invisible to us. So for example, we might say, inside of the nucleus is the nucleolus, and inside of the nucleolus are ribosomes, and ribosomes are responsible for producing protein, right? It's just the story of some stuff that's happening. But there are, at times, more new science words in an introductory biology class than there would be in an introductory Spanish class. Yeah. And the challenge is that in Spanish, you're getting, in Spanish, it's a new word for an old idea. You're still learning about tables and chairs. It's things that you know about. But in science, you're getting new language and new ideas simultaneously. And so what we talk about in the book is that this produces what we call this language identity dilemma. And one side, the dilemma is that the kids don't understand. Like, I just don't know what you're talking about. You offered a gibberish filled explanation, and I'm like, I don't want to be here anymore, right? The second aspect is if I had any doubt about whether I'm supposed to be in science, if I'm supposed to be part of this community, you basically sent me a message that I don't belong. So I can't think of any other context where you go and then people don't speak your language that you can feel ultimately comfortable and welcomed, right? So in science, we make no affordances to make sure that students feel comfortable. So that's just one aspect of it, right? Yeah. The other aspect of it is that we also expect the kids to explain science ideas in science language. If I learned about it in the context of a barbershop or working on a garage with my dad or grandpa, I will know science in the context of the language of the car garage, the language of the barbershop. And so when you ask me about the science ideas, teachers are attuned and listening to science language. And what we want to do is make sure that there is a separation between understanding the idea and then learning the language of science. And so in those two instances, I think we stress students out, we make them confused, and we don't really hear just how brilliant kids are because we're listening for science ideas explained in science language.
Is it something like almost like a sterilization when it comes to science? Like, science prides itself on, not being subjective, I guess, and not having those kinds of emotional things inside it and say, like, look, it's just the hard science. And that is, can I say that you're saying that maybe that sort of attitude is working against, reaching your audience?
Certainly. I think that science has been able to hide itself from some of the larger critiques in education around culture and teaching because we can hide under the idea that science is for the intellectually elite and it's for those who have the greatest capacity to learn, when in fact it is more of an indictment of how we teach. So if you go to most college professors and even a lot of AP science teachers, the word teach is analogous to lecture, right? Even though everything we know about teaching and learning suggests that lecture is the least efficient mode of teaching. And then when the students don't learn well, we make the argument, well, it's difficult content. And that's not at all the case. And so we know a lot about learning and we know a lot about teaching, but in science, we fail to marry those two. And so going back to the original question, the real issue is and I'm speaking in broad strokes, and certainly it's not representative of the incredible teachers that are out there, but we're not teaching in the ways that learning works, particularly in the high-end science concepts. And so we're not serving our students well if we don't teach in a way that really supports their learning.
Yeah, and I suppose some of our AP teachers are probably listening saying, no, I don't do just lecture. So I maybe want to roll back my comment to making it so obvious on that. But I mean, there, you can't get past the fact that there is this like AP higher level, like, welcome to the, business class of science or something like that it just kind of makes it elite. And given sometimes the amount of content that has to be covered, there's often still a discussion talking about coverage for the exam. And yeah, that doesn't necessarily connect to your day to day and your culture and your home life, those kinds of things.
Well, as a science teacher educator, I start with this discussion, right? And so the thing that I use as a fundamental example is just cognitive capacity. And so for the older people like myself, I can say, there was a time when we remembered everyone's phone numbers. And so if I were to ask you, hey, Brian, what's Ed's phone number? You can give me the number and rattle it off, right? And so uniformly, when I ask this question, I ask them very simply, why is it that we don't remember phone numbers anymore, right? And everyone can tie it to one event, and that is as soon as their smartphones enabled you to scroll down and hit the button. And interestingly enough, we had devices, if you're old enough, you might have had a Palm Pilot, and the Palm Pilot had all the phone numbers. It wasn't until it was connected to the phone, right? So
plenty of people carried the book around.
Exactly, even the little black book, the notorious black book, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't until we had the iPhone that we stopped using that information, and it's for a very simple reason. The information was no longer necessary. So if we're really teaching, and we want people to teach well, we teach science content in the context that creates the necessity. So this is what Jean Lay talked about, situated cognition. So, carpenters are incredible at measurement, not because they went to measurement school, but if I'm going to build a chair, it requires precise measurement. If I'm going to build a door, it's going to require precise measuring. So they had that phrase, right? Measure twice, cut once, because their actions are deeply driven by the need to measure accurately. So going back to this content understanding versus coverage issue, is that would suggest that just talking about it or going over it produces learning. And I'm making a different argument. The argument is that if we teach students in the situations in which they live, becomes even more difficult for them to forget it because they're seeing it. It's like punching the number in. So let me give a practical example. I would never go in a room and teach students osmosis to say, okay, hey, we're going to learn about osmosis today. And what I would do is to say, you ever wonder why they spray the vegetables at the grocery store? Right? That's one level of it, because every time they walk into that grocery store, I want them to trigger that memory that, oh, that's osmosis. They're trying to convince us that these dead vegetables are healthier than they actually are by spraying water on the outside of these vegetables and hoping osmosis will happen, right? Or marinating meat, right? And this to me can be even more powerful because it has a cultural component. If you're at home with grandma and she's marinating some meat for dinner, that is the story of osmosis. And so teaching in context is how people remember information anyway. And so the methods, and this is part of what I'm talking about in the book, is that when we think about coverage, we think that culturally specific teaching is going to hinder learning, when in fact it should do the exact opposite. It should make it so that they're seeing the content and then they're less likely to forget or have confusion about what the actual content is.
This to me sounds like just a classic assess prior knowledge approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I also think there's an opportunity here to maybe adjust or recalibrate metaphors that we use to teach science, or models. When, my backgrounds as a white Christian science teacher, for instance, might be a lot different than the students in my classroom. My metaphors and how I teach science and how I try to explain it to people might be a lot different. But what you're saying is we need to step out of some of our own skin and get into our students' lives in terms of where they might see science better in their own daily life.
That's exactly it. So I worked at Michigan State before I joined the faculty here at Stanford. And at Michigan State, we use a teaching approach, cognitive apprenticeship lesson planning, which a lot of teachers use. It's I do, we do, you do, where you structure the lesson to be a little bit more teacher-centered at first. And so the only adjustment we're making here is to say you certainly want to teach in a way that drives the necessity of learning, but because of your age and the distance that you have from the kids in that particular community you're teaching in, you've got to relearn where the science happens in their life. So even if I were to go, African-American Christian man, science teacher, if I were to go back to the same neighborhood that I grew up in, things are different. And so maybe some of those things are exactly the same, but I've got to relearn the science in the context of that community as a way to plan really rich lessons. And so that is actually the most complicated part of what we're talking about, because it requires pedagogical content knowledge that you probably don't have as a teacher, and you probably weren't taught that way, but it is how learning works. And so if we teach science in the context of the kids' lives, we have a really powerful opportunity. Is
this also a charge beyond classroom educators, and I think to like museums and other places, other informal science education places where we might need to learn science, but in a slightly different way?
Well, I'm hesitant to go that far because I'm not a researcher, so the empirical evidence I have is limited to K-12 classrooms, and so I won't push beyond that. What I do love about the informal spaces is that they are incredible at knowing their demographic. I had an opportunity to talk with people here who designed the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and their goal, as they stated, was as soon as the kids walk into the museum, they want tons of physical science. I can see the phenomena, hands-on activities that the kids can be at for 2 minutes or so. And then they anticipate 20 to 30 minutes in, the kids will get tired, and then they'll sit down in one of the booth areas. And in those areas, there's more direct instruction. There's videos, there's interactive games, but they have a real intention that is rooted in understanding who their demographic is. And their demographic are kids aged 3 to 16, right? And so they're not going to go in with great analytical minds, but great curiosity, and to be able to see phenomena is what starts this learning process. So I think the informal environments are actually doing a much better job at designing instruction to meet the needs of the kids than some of the formal environments that I spend my time studying.
I wonder, too, I think about schools that may have limited resources, and especially in science. And in our neck of the woods, science is tested less than other subjects, and so they get less time of instruction. They get less support financially for curricular materials. And what would your advice be for a teacher in that situation who wants to adapt their education for their science teaching for their students without having rich tools or technology available?
Great question. And I think this is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I truly believe in the brilliance of teachers. But I also understand the situation that teachers are in. So if we say to teachers that your job, and this is in the elementary school context, is contingent on how well your students are scoring, and then say you're not going to test your students on science until they get to the 5th grade, you're telling kindergarten teachers through 4th grade teachers, don't teach science because it's irrelevant. We're making a statement because our value system explicitly says that we don't really value this. So what we then do is those teachers focus on literacy and math, and then we give them a hard time to say, hey, you didn't do a good job of teaching science, when they're negatively incentivized to do it. That's one issue that I have with the whole assessment paradigm that we currently operating under. The second is that we force teachers to do it alone. Like, I can't think of a website that I can go to right now to say, hey, I'm working with a really energetic group of Latino girls. Where can I find really good lessons that speak to their interests? Right? We're leading every teacher to regenerate curriculum, and there's not a warehouse for here's where this curriculum might exist. And so we're actually trying to do that now. So we're hoping that our web-based app, Science in the City, could do that. not that we want to build it, but we want to connect teachers so they can start supporting each other. I've always wondered why we don't have just a database where we can go out and get excellent science instruction. I'm going to give you an example in closing this point. I joined the teaching staff at Long Beach Jordan High School in Long Beach, California in 1996. And the greatest mentor teacher of all time is in Jeff Johnson. Jeff is out there, hello. But he just handed me curriculum, a year's worth of curriculum. Here's what the lab needs are, and I have them here for you. Here's what the instructional components are. You just need to adjust this to your style and your kids. And it was a great resource. And it was old school. I'm talking about a 3-ring binder. So it's 2019, and where do teachers go to get this kind of free information, right? And we just are not working together in a way that would support teachers who don't have resources, because we're all in this together.
I'm thumbing through your book digitally here, and I stumbled upon this section here. So your book is called Science in the City, and you're right. In some ways, we teach students under false pretense. We celebrate them when they use science language accurately, but we never establish a framework for how science language should be learned. In a generation with more multilingual and multicultural students than ever in the classroom, teachers will have to broaden their conception of science language. Some of the things that you've been talking about there, but you list off some of the sort of like classic descriptions in a class, like the velocity of a baseball and things like that, and kind of comparing just the terms we're using. Can you tell us more about that?
So there's two levels of this. The first is kind of the rules of engagement, right? So here's the rules of a modern classroom. Is the teacher asks a question, and then a single student is supposed to respond, and they're supposed to respond accurately. And I find that to be ironic, because the one person who knows all the content is the teacher. So if the kids are in chemistry class, there's one thing that they absolutely should not know, and that is chemistry. So then why are we asking them questions about chemistry that they're supposed to answer? It doesn't make sense to me. Let me give you the alternative. When you go to Spanish class, the Spanish teacher says, okay, we don't know Spanish, and so here's the rules of engagement. We're only going to speak Spanish because you not knowing the word will produce a bit of confusion. And then what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to then ask me what the right word is. And as long as you keep speaking broken Spanish, you'll get to fluent Spanish. But we don't do the same thing in science class. We just allow kids to say things, and we don't have a actual explicit agenda for how we will get to fluency.
Sure.
Point being is if we want everybody to learn, then we need 30 kids in the classroom all speaking broken science. They all need an opportunity to explain an idea, to correct it, to talk about it again, and the teacher has to be explicit that we are learning new words, and so I need you to explain this idea with these new science words. What we do now is we allow that to be a subtext of the conversation, but we're not explicit about using science language. And those who are aware of it, they do something else. They put the words on the wall, right? As if that's how you learn language. So the point for me is that we are really knowledgeable about how language works. So we need to do a better job of being explicit about, if you're going to master the language of science, here's how we're going to do it in this particular classroom.
Mm-hmm. This brings back some memory to me, and I'm using that term. You'll get this in a second. I listened to a recent podcast from the learning scientists talking about memorizing facts versus using information, and they had Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath talking about how we need to make sure that if we want students to engage in thinking and in processing information, we have to really make sure that they understand that vocabulary. And one of the things that I think about when I watch a Spanish class happening or a French class happening is that they're very upfront about the vocabulary, that it's a very clear, you need to learn this vocabulary so you can speak the language, and we're going to push you into that immersive kind of practice with learning the language. And I maybe see less of that happening in science class than we did maybe 2 decades ago, where the vocabulary was very much a forefront of most lessons or most units, for instance, and then maybe engaging in that vocabulary happened a little bit later. I see a lot of people dumping into the, let's practice with the language, but not necessarily know the vocabulary ahead of time. And I think that's kind of what you're saying there, right?
Certainly. So we did a bunch of experiments on this. And what if you just taught the concept with the simple language first, but then you were explicit to students? Now I want you to explain using this newly acquired language. And so, not surprisingly, we found the students retained the content much better, and that their performances were stronger. And so I think the explicit nature of making sure that we're teaching the language of science really has some impact. And there's another dimension. And that other dimension is that as teachers start to see the language and content as separate, you then can see that the students know a lot more than you might imagine. And the example in the book is I studied a baseball team and asked them about the physics of a curveball. And they had none of the words right? So the words were actually opposite. So when they talked about the speed of a baseball, and baseball is called velocity, how fast the pitcher is throwing the ball. When they talked about the velocity or direction of movement, how quickly a ball moves left or right or jumps up and down, they have lots of terms for it. It's called bite. They call movement. And so these are terms that are they're not natural analogies. They're actually opposites of the actual science term. But then they also have other words that lined up perfectly. And so part of what would become invisible if you never just separated language and concept was that these kids had a really thorough understanding of the concept. For example, they were talking about drag by saying the seams and the air relationship on the top of the ball, there's greater pressure on top than on the bottom. Well, they're never going to say Magnus effect because it doesn't apply to the context of baseball. But they knew everything but the word. And so part of what I'm really challenging us to do as teachers is to see the science and the language as separate so we can do a better job of serving the kids.
You know what this reminds me of? This is what I was going to say earlier. I used to have freshman science students come to me, and they were doing maybe part of their homework or something, and they would come up, usually at the beginning of the year before they knew me, and they were like, "Is this what you want?" And they'd point to what they wrote down. Like it was some sort of vocabulary matching game. Like they didn't make any connection to their actual language. Or they would come up and say, well, what should I put for this one? And I'm like, and it was like, describe. The question was asking them to describe something or something like that. What should I put for this one? And I'm like, I want you to put what you see it as. And they just like, well, some kids were sort of like, are you sure? Like, I'm supposed to write how I see the world here? Don't you want the science one? The science answer?
Yeah.
They're just not being invited enough sometimes to do that.
Well, I would add another layer, and that other layer is that we as science teachers don't need to do anything but listen to our colleagues, because the English teachers have a clear sense, the Spanish teachers have a clear sense of how language learning works, and they're adopting it. I mean, one of the chapters of the book is about what we call generative instruction. I won't bore you with that, but it started with a story, and I was talking to a teacher, and I asked her about an elementary school teacher, a kindergarten teacher, how do you teach reading? And so she showed me the picture with a picture that the kids had drawn, and then she asked the kids to write a sentence underneath. And she knows that the kids are going to spell it wrong, but they also know that they're going to spell it wrong. So what she does is erase the misspelled words and then pencil very lightly underneath it. She writes the correct spelled word so that they can go back and then write the correct version of the word. So I asked her why she did it that way. And she said, number one is that they're not decoding the story, right? So they're not decoding language, like reading a word on the page and trying to figure out what does the symbol system mean. Because they drew the picture, they know exactly what the meaning is. They're just adding the symbol system to represent their ideas, right? And she called that encoding. And she said that is a more efficient way to learn than decoding, which is to see a symbol system, make sense of it, and then translate. And my mind is blown, right? It's kindergarten. I'm thinking kindergarten, you play, you sing some songs, right? No, she had a rich understanding of how learning works based on this encoding, decoding paradigm. And more importantly, she had a system that really encouraged the kids. So, for example, they knew that writing the wrong answer was the first step in learning how to spell a word, right? you can't offer wrong answers in science. In fact, if the teacher asks you to explain something and you say the wrong version, the teacher will say, okay, someone else, just rudely move on to the next person, right? This is a culture of affirmation around spelling things wrong. And so my point here is that we don't need to look far to figure out better teaching practices around language and cognition, because it's already been done. We just need to translate a lot of what has happened in literacy studies and math studies, because the information is already there.
I see. Your book, how would you describe it to listeners? I kind of have a sense of it by looking at it. Is it an explainer? Is it a workbook kind of scenario? What will they leave with? A charge, or will they leave with some suggestions on what to do next?
So it is a research professor trying to write a narrative story. So you have to read it with a grain of salt, because I try to write it as simply and as narrative as I can, as a person who's not traditionally a writer. So it is written for teachers. And what it is a theory to practice. And so the first few chapters are the ideas that we're talking about today. How identity matters for teaching, how language plays a role, how technology can be a mediator. And so the first part is theory. Here are the ideas that I need you to understand to better serve your kids. And it's paired with research. So none of this is just theory. We've done classroom experimental research for all of these things that we're talking about. So that's the first half. The second half is it's a teacher training manual. It is, here's what you do and how you organize your lesson plans. Here's how you organize your day so that you can engage in this practice. And so it's intended to be theory and practice, and written as efficiently. It's very short. It's a 200-page book, written with simple language. I think part of my struggle has been, how can you, as an academic who talks about the complexity of language and what it does to people, then write something academic that is complex in language? And so I have to try to figure out how to keep it simple. And so it is written simply, and it's a theory to practice book.
What about the website? Is that set to accompany the book, or could it be used separately? How would teachers use that?
So, good question. So we're looking for project partners with the website. So the website are trying to build a database where teachers can connect and support each other, add and download lessons. And so we have a series of lessons there, but we haven't fleshed it out yet. We're still working on building a fully fleshed out NGSS curriculum resource where teachers can go and get culturally relevant resources and training. So that is a new project that we're just starting out on. And so, I invite people to join us there to get connected. And we're looking for people to help us build something to support all teachers moving forward.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Bryan. It's a fascinating conversation, and I always like conversations that challenge me to think about my own teaching in my classrooms, and working with teachers as well, to think about ways that I can reach my students better. So first of all, thank you for that, and I look forward to seeing more on the website and the book.
Well, I appreciate you having me. It's been fun. Teachers are all we need. We have everything we need to really do something big. We just have to do it together.
Excellent. Thanks much. Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.